Hi, for everyone at home. I'm Nicole Zuckerman, and this is a collection of teachers that have gathered to talk about making our dance community safe, especially in light of things that happened a couple of months ago. They want to take a look at the way that our community works and um, teacher and student dynamics, and a number of other things. So this is a very smart and thoughtful group of people. So let's get right into it. We'll just go ahead and introduce them for a quick second. Andy?
Hi, my name is Andy Reid. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I've been around being a part of this very interesting and wonderful scene for about 15 years now.
Great, glad to have you on. Hi, Laura. Laura, you're still muted.
Thanks. I'll try again. Hey, my name is Laura Keat. I am proficient at dancing, but not using the internet, apparently. I live in Orange County, and I'm super excited to talk about this stuff with you guys.
Super glad to have you on.
Thank you.
Hi, Naomi.
My name is Naomi Uyama, and I have been teaching Lindy Hop for the last about 15 or 16 years, nationally and internationally, and I also teach locally.
Cool. Welcome, Sylvia.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Sykes. I live in Santa Barbara, California, and I've been teaching since before all y'all were born.
All right. Hi, Peter.
Hey there, my name's Peter Strom, and I've been teaching for about 15 years or so around the scene, and I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In fact, I'm 2 rooms away from Naomi right now.
Awesome. We also have Spuds, who's on the ones and twos, who's going to be making sure that technically things are working for you guys, but he's just here for observational purposes, and honestly, so am I. So let's get right down to what we're here for. I am super interested in what all of you guys have to say about, let's say, in light of recent events and about the topic of making our community safe and better in general. So if anyone wants to start it off, or I can pick one of you at random. Hey, Peter, your face is big on my computer, so why don't you start us off?
Awesome. For me, this is very much about things in the aftermath of Stephen Mitchell, the allegations about him and the sort of revelations about what he was doing for many years with a lot of these women in the scene. And I saw some of the other talks you guys did, and there was a huge uproar on the internet. And one of the things that's important to me, if we get to talk about this now, is it seems there are 2 parts of this talk that could be really nice. One, some of the key elements of what I feel like Stephen did wrong and how he transgressed against these women, and I think in some ways against the community at large, involved his power and sort of status as a teacher. And so I thought it would be great if we could sort of talk as teachers and people who encounter some of the same power dynamics and see some of the same things on the scene, and get a wide breadth of experience on the scene, traveling far and wide, to sort of give our perspective on what some of those things, how we think some of those things went down, how we can change them to maybe not happen more. And also, I think since so much of the discussion happened so fast because of the speed of the internet, I want this discussion to continue on and not just be done because we talked ourselves out on the internet and on Facebook about it. It seems to me there's so much more to talk about, and a lot of the difficulties about this thing with Stephen, and I think that Stephen's issues revealed about the whole scene. It seemed like those are things that take a lot of time to process. Even by somebody who's really smart emotionally and mentally and everything, it takes time to process that. And I know that the online discussion I've seen has died down a lot since then, and I'm excited to sort of like talk to people about what they've come to with a little bit more time to reflect on this thing. And I'm really interested to hear what some other instructors have to say. I'm happy to share some of what I have to say.
One of the things that was really frustrating for me when all of the, as Peter said, allegations against Stephen came out was so many people who were really shocked or said they were really shocked that this happened. And for me, knowing Stephen, I was not shocked at all. Knowing him and things that I had seen and heard, I didn't know that any of this had happened or that it had gone as far as it had. But seeing how he carried himself and how he treated women, it was not at all a surprise to me. And it shouldn't have been a surprise to a lot of the people who said they were surprised. I think that's because a lot of times we sweep those things under the rug, we joke them off, we laugh them off, and we'd say, oh, he's just like that or she's just like that, and we don't respect it and we don't pay attention to those things. And I don't know, it shouldn't have been a surprise, and he's not the only one. I see a lot of people who are in a position of power, dancers who are good dancers, men and women, who are abusing the respect that they're given and just pushing people past their comfort zones because people don't stand up to them as consistently as they might to somebody else. And I really would like to see that change.
Yeah, I agree with Laura. It's there's way more than just Stephen who's doing this stuff, and it's pervasive in our culture. It's pervasive. I really do think it's pervasive in our culture. Plus, I'm kind of a dinosaur next to you guys. When I came up, when I was younger, when I first came into the swing dancing, that was just the plain old standard MO that everybody had. It wasn't a shock. I mean, basically, anybody in a position of power, which was the good dancers or the people who were DJs or the people who were band members, could, use, if not abuse people, get them to, I mean, not just for sex, but could get them to, I don't know, go to the grocery store with them or wash their car and things like this. I mean, it's pervasive, and it was pervasive in the culture, not just in swing dancing, but back in the day when I was coming up just as a teenager and a young adult woman. That was basically what happened. So I'm a little bit more immune to this just because it's something that I've had to grow up with all the time. But I am also shocked that anybody was shocked that Stephen was doing some of these things. I was a little bit shocked about underage people because I was unaware of that aspect, but I wasn't unaware of any of the rest of it. And personally for myself, when I see somebody who is being inappropriate with somebody who's underage, I do call them out on it, and I talk to the underage person. That's something I've done since the get-go. Or if you see somebody who is not, maybe they're legally of age, but they're really not mature enough to handle the situation. You can see that stuff coming. You can see an awkward person being paid attention to, and they don't have the skills to know how to respond or where the line might be for them. And instead of talking to them about it so much, I would talk to the perpetrator and say, look, they're not really able to make a reasonable decision even though they're of age, and so I think that you should back off and go hang out with somebody who's got the skills to say yes or no to you.
Yeah, I think those are really good points that you bring up. I'm curious about whether the other instructors feel like it's easy to see these dynamics playing out and to understand what their role is in preventing these things from happening in the future. I mean, I, innocent bystander, would have a hard time coming up to someone before all this stuff happened and saying, hey, I think what you're doing is inappropriate. I feel like we, in general, have a policy of non-interference unless it's very, very obvious. But I wonder if that is a part of the sort of student-teacher dynamic, because I am certainly not on your guys' level of dancing or teaching or anything, and I look up to you guys, and I wonder if my, for example, unwillingness to come forward unless it's really serious is a continued part of that imbalance.
I think there's a lot of fear of creating a witch hunt, so to speak, and so that's why people are like, I don't want to say anything unless I'm sure. And you got to be careful, because making a false accusation can ruin somebody's life. So there is that aspect. On the other hand, that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. Recently, I was at an event where I saw a guy in a very prominent position with a girl who was pretty young. And in my experience, I had known this guy was kind of pushy about certain things, not in a terrible way, but just slightly on the borderline of what's appropriate. And I went to the promoter and I just said, hey, I don't know anything for sure, but I've had situations that are questionable with this guy, and I'm under the impression that there's something going on, but I would never want to see, like, this person is super cool, and I would never want to see them not a part of the scene. So it would be really cool if somebody in your position would just go talk to both people involved separately and just check up on things and make sure it's cool, and that person had the power to, to be able to say, hey, you can't come to my events if you're going to behave this way or not. And it actually turned out, the end of the story is a long thing, but it turned out really well. And I don't know, I think going to somebody who maybe has power, especially a peer somebody who's a peer of the person you're concerned about, can help a lot. I know it's easier to listen to somebody that you respect, and it's also easier to bring in a third party that maybe isn't as emotionally involved in the situation sometimes.
I think one of the beautiful things about our dance scene is that we're incredibly accepting and permissive of a lot of people, and a lot of people who have sometimes pretty poor social skills, and maybe are just learning to flourish as a person in a scene. And I think a lot of the reason a lot of people walk around with blinders on is because they're in the habit of doing that. And I think one thing that has really changed for me in the last couple of months is I've been being able to see the difference between those two things a lot better. The difference between someone just having a hard time, going up to someone and saying something and stumbling on their words and kind of offending them. The difference between that and being abusive or predatory or whatever you want to call it. And I think the people who can do that are not just people in positions of, like, the people in this room power, but also people who just kind of know how to dance a little bit better. I live in New Orleans, and I go out dancing, and there are a lot of people who just have just enough skill to show new people the dance floor. And sometimes I watch some of them, and I've been watching them a lot, and some of them I think it's wonderful that you're going around and teaching all these people to dance. I wish I was that open and free and not so shy. And for other people, I watch with a little bit more scrutiny, and I think with all of this, if we hold people to the standard, to everyone to the same standard of, you can stumble over your words, you can do things that are kind of awkward, but if you make someone uncomfortable, someone should be able to say, hey, you're making someone uncomfortable, whether they mean to or not, whether they're dangerous or not. Because it's kind of like you're in a class and someone is doing something and hurting someone. They probably don't want to be hurting someone. But because we're so permissive and so nice, we're like, oh, they don't really mean to. But the real compassionate thing to do is be like, hey, buddy, you're hurting this person. You don't want to do that. Stop. And that takes a little bit more courage, I guess. But for me, that switch has really happened over the last couple of months, where my eyes have been bigger, and I've been more willing to just kind of be very, like, compassionately forward with people. And I think that's something that we all have to do, not just people who are teachers, but like people's friends. Like, if you see someone being weird to your friend, you say, hey, that person seems to be weird to you. What can we do about it? Or you go and talk to the person and you say, I don't know if you mean to be doing this, but this isn't okay. And that's one of the things that, like, Laura, you were worried about leveling accusations, and I think one of the greatest ways to put the brakes on these things is like, we see this behavior. We don't know if you mean to be bad. We're going to even assume that you don't, but we do see this behavior, and it's making people uncomfortable, or it's problematic, or could be problematic. So check yourself, because we're also checking you.
I think that's a super important thing, just that idea of seeing people and letting people know that you're seeing them. I think one of the things for me that, having known Stephen for a long time, like, he was a really charismatic person. I mean, he still is, but I mean, that's part of the difficulty, that charisma, which had a real good side, it had a downside. I think he used it for some negative things. And what I noticed is that I found myself looking away from him at the times that he decided and that he wanted. And so, like Laura said, and Sylvia, like, I wasn't surprised, but I was surprised and unsurprised. I didn't know about the super young girls, but I had some general sense about him and the ladies. And what I realized in retrospect is that what I did, and what I think he sort of like made feel like the right thing to do, was I looked away a lot. You know what I mean? Not purposefully, and it was just a going along social thing. And I think if we can just get out of the habit of looking away and just be okay with a little bit more discomfort socially, just to be like, I see you sneaking off to hook up with somebody. It's fine if you sneak off to hook up with somebody, but I see it. And if you are okay with that hookup, that's fine. Go do that. But that seeing is a big thing. And I would like to say something briefly too about like trying to, like Andy, you were saying about trying to say something to people, especially in your local scene. Like I had a little thing where someone at one of our local dances where I go and people know who I am, but I'm not necessarily in charge. Someone told me, this is like a week or two after the Stephen thing, they said, hey, this guy's lifting the girls up. He just did it to me. It really sucks. It's super uncomfortable, and it's really not cool. Can you tell him to stop? And I was like, sure, because I had literally, this is one of my students, I had literally told her, like, hey, if something weird happens, tell me. And so she was, and so then I went to talk to this guy. And I have to say, I did it really poorly, and it went very poorly. And I think I essentially sort of ruined his night. And I tried to be really nice about it at first. And what I tried at first was to really talk around the thing and to ask him, like, just say, hey, this is sort of a policy. We don't lift the followers out here. It's sort of like an aerial. It's not super safe on a social dance floor. And he was really not willing to listen and really uncool about it, actually. And he said, you know, no one's complained to me, which is like the classic thing, that no one would complain to you because you're a jerk and they don't think you want to hear it, which you don't. So he was very uncool about this, and I ended up having to sort of bludgeon him with the fact that indeed someone did tell me that you are doing this and it's unpleasant and they want you to stop, and they told me to tell you to stop. So there you go. That's what it is. I hope you have a good night. I tried to make it positive, but it was really a tough experience that I think I handled very clumsily, and that really bummed this guy out, probably ruined his night. I hope he comes out and dances more. And what I was so struck by was that what I should have felt was proud that I did it and happy that I had made a lot of other people's nights better by getting this guy to stop doing this behavior, which was really all about himself and really inconsiderate. And what I felt emotionally was really bad, that I hurt this guy's feelings. And I think that's one of the difficulties that we face, and that's like a very small scale version of this, but it scales up very it scales up very similarly for me when we think about people in much higher power positions and much more dangerous or inappropriate scenarios, that it is hard to take that step to say something to somebody, and it may not go well. And I think it's really worth remembering that despite the negative emotions that might go along with it and some of the unhappy fallout of it, that if it is possible, you might be doing a sort of greater good. And I think I'm very happy I did it when I think about it. Like, I definitely think several girls' nights at the dance will be better because his night was maybe kind of bad. And that's a trade-off I'm very happy to make in my mind, but it was very hard to make on the spot. And I think it's something we have to be like honest with ourselves about. because I think there's been a lot of talk about safe spaces and how simple it is to do that, and I think it's really, really hard to do that, to make an actual change personally.
Yeah, it is difficult, especially when they're your students. I've been teaching for a long time, and I'll have usually awkward men. Every once in a while, it's an awkward woman who just creeps people out. They're not really trying. They're not predators. They're not trying to do anything odd. They're just odd folks. And so in that situation, I usually don't tell them, look, you're creeping people out, don't do this. I just kind of try to give them a new way of dealing with whatever it is they're doing. Like if they can't ask someone to dance in a decent way, say, well, hey, I know you're probably feeling a little awkward about this, but if you try it in another way, instead of walking up and grabbing a guy's ass, maybe you walk up and say, hey, would you like to dance? Just give them a more appropriate way to deal with something. So I've never felt uncomfortable about that so much. I do sometimes feel uncomfortable when I have a student, especially a long-standing student, who is, taken with somebody and is kind of coming on strong to them, and the it's unwanted attention by the receiving party. So if they're dancing in a circle and I change partners, I see that this is going on, and this is a follower and a leader. The follower said, hey, this guy's kind of coming on too strong for me. So when I do the rotation, I only leave him there for a few moments, and then I rotate him out away from her so they can kind of maintain that. And when he continued to try to ask her to dance at the practice dances, like 2 or 3 dances in a row, and she'd go, no, just one at a time. And he'd go, well, hey, what's wrong? Well, that's when I had to step in and say, look, I understand that you're interested in this woman, but you're coming on too strong. It's uncomfortable for her, and I know that you don't intend that at all. So maybe just, ask her once, and then you can't ask her again for at least another half hour, something like that. Just give them a little bit of tools. That still is a little bit uncomfortable for me. But when I see somebody who's a predator going after somebody who's in a weaker position, that's really easy for me to step up for, because I don't feel guilty about screwing that person's night or screwing that person's week up at all. I've had several of my past partners in my life, dance life, have acted inappropriately to students, and I had no problem whatsoever saying, this has got to stop, and if it doesn't, I'm out of here. I mean, we just have to step up for the weaker people. And as Andy was mentioning, you kind of get an idea between awkwardness, inappropriate because you really don't know any better, and people who are abusing their power, their position of having some kind of authority assumed in the scene, whether they're just a better dancer or whatever that is. And we can really tell the difference for the most part. And I don't think we have to out anybody. I don't think we have to publicly shame anybody. I think we need to go to the perpetrator and say, this isn't cool. I assume you don't mean it this way, but this is how it's coming off. And the more of us that step up and say this and take responsibility, I think the less creepy it'll feel to us. It'll become much more the norm. Right now it feels a little bit odd because it's not the norm.
I know the point of this talk is that we're all instructors talking about how we deal with situations that have come up pre the whole Stephen thing blowing up and post the whole Stephen thing blowing up, and I think we should continue that. But just to go back to Nicole's original point that she put out there, since I haven't commented yet, that feeling of not wanting to bother someone who is a teacher that you have being some sort of extension of some thread in this issue, the issue that's, I mean, it's a very multifaceted issue that's come up with this huge issue with Stephen. I do think that that's true. I do think that that's insightful of you, Nicole, to think of the idea of not wanting to overstep some boundary or to be able to talk to someone when you don't feel necessarily like they're your dance peer. I think that that is some aspect of what was going on with Stephen and what goes on a lot of the time, and I think it's important for people to look at. I also think it's a little impossible for anyone just by wishing that it weren't there to make it disappear, because I think that that's just an aspect of life outside Lindy Hop that people who have some skills in something that you're very passionate about, you're going to treat them slightly differently. I know that I did when I started, and not because I like getting that extra treatment or juice, but just because I recognize that as sort of a human trait. I think that it's not very productive to talk about wishing that away entirely. I would love if there was less of it, because I actually am a bit uncomfortable with some of the product of that. I also get a lot of benefit from some of the product of that too. So I can't say that I don't get both sides of that, but I do think that it hasn't come up yet. And I would like to say that the idea of just, we shouldn't have a weird power dynamic between teachers and students. Saying that doesn't take the feeling away from a lot of people, both teachers and students. And I want the idea that when that power dynamic is present, which will be a lot of the time, that the people who are getting more power in that situation take more responsibility. And I think that's what everybody on the panel is talking about, how they're stepping up and doing that in different ways. And I think it's good for us to share, because I know that there are a lot of teachers on both our level and a local level that are involved in this thing. And a lot of students are curious to hear about how we're dealing with it as well. But I think that power dynamic is just going to be there. And I think the people who are given the benefit of that power dynamic should be the ones who are held most accountable and be most responsible and most graceful with it and not abuse it. I think that's the problem. It being there doesn't mean it's necessarily always going to be abused, but it is there. It is there. And I would just say, like, we were talking earlier, Laura, about how an accusation can really ruin somebody's life. I know that's a big fear for people inside and outside the Lindy Hop world. And I would just say, like, asking a question is not the same as having an accusation. I know it can have the weird feeling of one, and it can have the weird stink of one, but I know for myself personally, you know, asking a question, especially directly to somebody, where I'm curious about what their motivation is behind something or behind an issue that I'm not quite sure of. I think before I would have speculated about it or asked somebody else about it. I wouldn't have asked the person directly, and I think that I'm coming to a point personally where I'm trying to be direct and ask that person, even though, like Peter said, it can sometimes really give you that gross emotional feeling of discomfort where, you know, it's not a conversation that you want to have, and it can be messy once that box is opened. Like, I've felt that personally myself, but I do believe that it's better to have it than to not. And I have also been very pleasantly surprised with some of the answers I've gotten from people, that they have thought about their motivations and they weren't, you know, as bad as I thought that they could be. So
I'm really glad to hear you guys talking about the false accusations and mentioning that, because that was, when I've discussed this online, a lot of people have been afraid of the witch hunt and false accusations, and a lot of the times it sounded to me like a little bit of a cop-out, as more of an excuse for inaction than looking for action. And I really like your idea, Naomi, about posing it as a question versus an accusation. I think that's not a perspective I've thought of before, so that's cool. One of the things that I thought was really positive coming out of this whole ordeal with Stephen was that I've heard from a lot of people who have really started to question their own actions because they looked up to and admired Stephen. And I think a lot of guys and girls, a lot of people kind of walked in his footsteps in the way he was charismatic and the way he was smooth with women, and that's a trend that's in the scene, and I see a lot of people taking on that and being smooth and hooking up, and at events it's a big place for people to hook up. And then once that came out, a lot of people are like, I've seen myself acting in the same way as Stephen in certain scenarios, and now Stephen is this person who's gone farther than I would ever go, but how different am I from him? And I think it made a lot of people kind of reflect and look back and be like, a lot of the actions that people are upset about Stephen, there was, I think, 2 levels of his actions that were concerning. One level was actual accusations of assault and rape, and then the other level was accusations or just inappropriate behavior and manipulation and coercion. And I think that level of manipulation and coercion, hearing the women who were so upset about that and hurt by that, kind of caused a lot of people to rethink their own actions and question, have I put other people in that situation? In fact, I even got an email from somebody who asked me if he had put me in that situation. And I was shocked. I was really shocked to hear from him. So I hope that a lot more people, I think you can kind of see people's motivation. If this scenario makes you question your own actions, it's a good thing. That's a good place to be. And if it's making you outraged and defensive of Stephen, then you should probably be questioning your own actions a little bit more. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, but I think self-reflection in a time like this is essential for every single one of us.
Well, I super, super hope that you're right, that a lot of, especially the instructors in the scene, because those are the people who are at the top of the totem pole of the power dynamic that is not a cause of the problem, but it does facilitate this problem. I really do hope you're right that a lot of people are looking at their own actions. I can't speak for them all. I certainly know that the instructors that I know, they're looking at theirs as well. I would just say one thing, that when I'm talking about accusations, I'm not talking about being someone who is personally involved in a situation. I'm talking about someone who's speculating. So when I'm talking about asking a question, it's because I wasn't there. When it comes to people who are accusing someone because they were actually in the situation, I can totally understand people being very sensitive about saying whether an accusation is false or not, because the thing is, when people are reporting something that was done to them, it's actually very, 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 very rare that that is a false accusation. The statistics are like ridiculously 1%, 2%. So when
Naomi's
people
been
start
doing some reading, you guys. Like she knows, she's read some books after this, so she's not making it up.
Yeah, I just want to put that out because when I'm saying, like, as someone who's at a lot of events and seeing things going on and not really know what's going on because I'm not actually there, instead of accusing that person of something that I think happened, I will ask them the question. But when it comes to people who are in a situation and they're accusing someone who was also in the situation of doing something that they did, that's a different type of accusation. I just want to put that out there for language purposes.
And I also think without blaming victims at all, I mean, you've got to understand that I come from a different place, but we also have to try to educate the other side of the equation, I think, and to educate people about how not to be a victim, how not to be pressured by somebody who has perceived power over them, or, you know, all right, so a cool guy's coming on to you, how you know, help our students be able to have the skills to be able to deal with these situations better, not just try to stop the people who are going to abuse or use their power. I think that that's another thing that would really help our scene, isn't just on one end of the equation, but to try to shore up the other end of the equation as well, is to give people better skills on how to deflect some of the unwanted attention, or what do I do when I'm kind of torn because there's this guy who's coming on to me who's really cute and he's a really great dancer, but I feel a little uncomfortable about it. You know, it's like, give people the skills on how to deal with those things too. I think that would be a very useful thing, because let's face it, we're not going to change human nature. It's not going to happen, and hookups are going to happen. And I think that that's part of what makes our scene good in some ways, is that it is a social thing beyond the dance floor. As long as people are aware of what they're walking into, I think that's fine. And I think that as I think Andy's talked about it earlier on, was that we do have a lot of folks who aren't particularly socially savvy in our scene, and that's what makes our scene welcoming, is if we can help these people, you know, give them some skills levels, I think that would be another thing to look out for.
When I started dancing in Ithaca, New York, and Ithaca was a place that both Stephen and Bill Borghita flourished. One part of this that I remember when I first started dancing, they had a little sign at the door, and a little piece of paper out the door. And the piece of paper at the door said stuff that lots of stuff about, like, be careful if you run into someone, say you're sorry. But one of the things was essentially yes to everybody. Those weren't the exact words, but like, and I think that's less of a rule now. But I remember when I started dancing, it was kind of a rule that we have to say yes to everyone. And I think I think we would have, if that never was a thing in our scene, I think we would be having a different conversation. Not because the intent of that is bad. The intent of that is beautiful. Should be welcoming to everyone, whether no matter who they are, older, younger, whatever, skill, no skill, anything. We should, but we, above everything else, should have agency over ourselves. And if one of the first things you hear or read is that you shouldn't be able to really make your own decisions, that's terrible. And I think something that how I've been welcoming people, like when for example, I have a friend that goes with me out and sees a band, and I know that they're like, for example, if it's a pretty woman that I'm like one of my pretty woman friends, sounds strange, sorry. I know that there's going to be a bunch of men who ask her to dance, and one of the things I say is, listen, you don't have to dance with anybody. If you don't want to dance with them, don't dance with them. But in general, people like to dance with each other. Most of these people are friendly. But if anyone is weird to you, if anyone does anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, don't take it. And you can come talk to me or whatever. I say it in a way that is not too intense. But if a lot of us were introduced to this dance, say, with the power to be open to people, but at the same time feel like this is my body. This is my body that it can't be that you shouldn't be hurting. It should be lifting up in the air if I want to be lifted up. That shouldn't be held too tight. I think we would be having a different conversation, and I think that's how in a delicate way should it be introducing people to the dance. I think the way that I was introduced to the dance did not breed something so good.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Andy. I think that's something that always rubbed me the wrong way because I had the same sort of general sense of it when I started. We started at similar times. I know I saw Scott on the last talk, Scott Cupid mentioned that he was going to stop that policy of sort of trying to get everyone to say yes to a dance. And I think something we should really think about in regards to what Sylvia was saying is just like, what are the things that we say to people in a local scene? And what's tricky is if we have experienced and responsible adults who are running local scenes, which sometimes we do and sometimes we maybe don't, if we have that, then it would be great if we could get some general like best practices out there, like some general things to say. Some of them being like, generally we say yes to dances, but you don't have to, and just empowering some people and saying like, if someone is giving you a ton of attention, just be considerate of it and trust your guts. Just some general ground rules. That could be a really helpful thing, because there are two sides to this interaction. My concern as well, though, is along the lines of what Naomi was saying. I really have the sense that there are a lot of instructors who are not doing the introspection that I would hope that everyone does after this. My sense is that there's a large number of people, probably the people who are closer in the continuum of sort of like, let's say there's very appropriate things you can do and then very inappropriate things you can do. I would say the people further along the inappropriate end of that spectrum are the people less inclined to introspection in general, and certainly less inclined to introspection in this case. There may be some, and what is a real concern to me, like I think the people in this forum, I'm really excited you guys are all here to talk, and this like shows like how much you're willing to think of it. I think what's tricky is not a lot of people have the authority or access or position of friendship or power to talk to some of the people who would be more abusive with their power in the position. And so one of my concerns is I wonder how we're going to make connections with some of the people who maybe need a little more connecting with on this thing. And some of us might have some ideas who they are. There's no like specific finger pointing to be done maybe, because if we knew of something real concrete negative that was happening, I think at this point we would say no, don't do that, and kind of intervene. But that sense of there being some inappropriate things going on out there, it does persist, and I've been surprised how little introspection I've heard from some corners. I did take it upon myself to email somebody. I saw someone posted something really great on Facebook as sort of a resource to survivors of abuse and stuff, and I knew for a fact that this person had had a very negative experience with somebody quite young in the past, and I was really confused about that, and I was really worried that this person was sort of posturing and not taking into account their own history. And I just wrote an email to this person, and it was, again, a real uncomfortable thing, and I'm sure it was unpleasant for them. In this case, I was really happily surprised with the way they responded. They had a lot of introspection, and they had not chosen to include their past in it because they didn't want to drag people into it. So that was really good. But I think we're going to have to find a way to have more interactions with people. And the difficult part is, as good as it is to sort of work on these things from the ground up with new dancers and sort of inculcating people to feel empowered to sort of trust their gut in a lot of these situations, and to be just considerate of, like, when you're getting a ton of attention and it seems undue, like maybe it is undue in one way. The difficulty I see is there's not a ton of people with access to some of the people who really might need to do some changing here. And I was struck by some of the reactions of Stephen's thing in the scene. I think the way that our scene treats dance instructors in particular is one of the things that facilitates this difficulty. And I don't see the power dynamics going away, but I do think we should maybe be a little considerate, particularly people who are in the last talk, the organizers. They have an actual, they're like the one hard point I see where they can really say, like, if you act in a way I believe is inappropriate, I will not give you money. And if nothing else, no matter how bad a person it is, like, not that there are these terrible people out there, but if someone's not willing to do introspection or listen to friends or peers, if they don't get hired and they don't get paid, they will listen, or they just won't be around. And I think that's something we should really think about is when people are doing their hiring, they should take into account, of course, dancing, of course, teaching. They should take into account the experience that people, that they see with people, and they should trust their gut. I think organizers should be really empowered to do that, because the people who talked on the last Google Hangout are people who are running some really big events, and they, I think, feel really empowered. And I think there's a million smaller events out there where the organizers might not feel like they have the same say, and they might feel like even they get some of that shine of the fancy instructor, like treating them nice or doing something, and then going off and doing things that they don't agree with, and they're faced with a difficult decision there. And I would just say, like, as an instructor, like, if I'm doing something you think is inappropriate, I think it's very much like within your rights and your position as an organizer to say, like, I don't think that's cool. I'd like you to do something different if you could, to address it. I think organizers particularly have a lot more power than they think in that case. And what's difficult is I think a lot of other people don't have as much power as we would like, but what organizers actually do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about empowering people to say something and to feel like they have ownership of behavior. And I wonder, so you mentioned that organizers are in a position to do something actionable about this. I wonder if there's anything you think that we can change about student-teacher dynamics in order to make it easier to do that. I agree that probably we're not going to be able to eradicate a power imbalance that has, existed for probably as long as Western culture has. But I wonder if there's anything that you think that we can do to shape how that goes, or how people are able to express themselves as part of it to make it easier. That's a really open-ended and really tough question, but
I, for one,
if anyone has any ideas.
Yeah, for sure. I would like to see more teacher-to-teacher accountability. I think this was kind of mentioned a little bit already. Naomi said something. But I think, I think it is hard for students to go up and say things to teachers, and I don't think that's going to change. But I really would like to see other teachers kind of talking to each other, as Naomi said, kind of asking each other, if you see questionable behavior, asking people about it. I I definitely would like to see promoters taking more action in who they hire. And that just makes sense. If you have an event that you want to have a certain environment, you should hire people who contribute to that kind of environment, teachers, staff, musicians. And lastly, one of the things I was kind of considering, or I've been considering, is just as a teacher, how much of an example we set. When I was first learning to dance, the local teachers were setting a strong example to the students, and the same thing with the international and regional. All the teachers set an example, and it's not just what they do off the floor, but if they talk to students in a schmoozy kind of flirty way, people around them who worship them or who look up to them or admire them or even deeply respect them see that behavior and tend to mimic it. And so I would love to see teachers just keeping in mind that whatever respect we want to see carried out from our students to each other, we need to be extra careful that we're carrying out that kind of respect, because people are watching whether we want them to or not every single moment. So I really would like to see us reminding each other and just holding each other accountable of that kind of behavior, and just reminding that respect is really crucial in this environment.
Regarding diffusing the kind of student instructor dynamic, the power dynamic. I can only speak to like kind of what I try to do that. And one thing that I've tried to do is just to remind people in my behavior and what I say in my behavior, that I'm really, like, the only reason I'm better at dancing than them is because I've been doing it longer, and I'm probably more obsessive, or maybe I'm maybe more unifocused on it, and all the people in the room probably have something that they're that good at, that they're doing, and I think one great way is to for example, last weekend I was at an event called the Boston Tea Party, and one of the things that I thought was really cool about it is they've been doing this for years and years and years. They make the all the West Coast Swing instructors, or most of them, have a Jack and Jill with the Lindy Hoppers, and we're all in this position of being kind of confused, being kind of scared, kind of not knowing what's going on. And I think it's a really nice thing to see, like, oh, they're just good at this thing, and I think I could easily purport myself in a way that makes me seem like I am absolutely good at everything I do, and I could speak in a way that's that. But no, I'm not. I'm not good at a lot of other things. I'm just good at dancing, and I think that really comes through. I would hope comes through on my attitude, and I do see people who have a different attitude, an attitude where their feces doesn't stink a little bit, and I don't know why I censored my, but I think this is one way that we can kind of minimize that up and down.
I think that's a real it's a good point that Andy makes, is just concretely for instructors. Like, if you are an instructor out there, if you are willing to share a weakness with your students, it can be very helpful, and it can just be a reminder that, like, basically, like, I know from talking to Andy in the past and from all of you guys, like, we've all done a private lesson with somebody where, like, we've thought to ourselves, wow, I'm really helping this person. They really need my help. They're not super good at this, and I'm helping make them better. I'm doing a great job. And then afterwards you say, so what do you do for the living? And they're like, oh, I'm a fucking Nobel laureate. I just went to Mars. Or I'm actually Mother Teresa in disguise. And, like, you find out that this person is concretely way more important than you in life, in a very, like, easy to add up way. And it's something that I remember all the time because it just happens so much. And I think students might not have that sense because they're in a very particular context in which we are important. And we are not important outside of that context necessarily. So reminding them of the relative nature of that thing can be really helpful. And at the same time, I think as instructors, it's really the burden is on us to be respectful of that context. I saw a lot of talk after like these sort of revelations about Stephen came out, and when people were talking about lots of instructors are doing it, and people were like, it's this rock star culture, and there's a lot of like deriding the rock star culture, and there was, by implication, a lot of sort of derision aimed at the general swing dance Lindy Hop community for being suckers and for being so gullible in this thing and being so star fuckery, as it were. And it's really not a very fair criticism, because very few people are their best selves in the context in which they're put, where they're put in a class where they're not super great at something, and even if they're good, even if they're really good students, our job is to find something that they still need to work on. And so we're always challenging them, and they're never in a place where they're most comfortable. In that position about something they really care about a lot, that is an artistic endeavor that you're sort of sharing yourself, you're literally embodying your expression, like, it's a really sensitive place to be. And I found that very few people are their best selves. They're most self-actualized, they're most empowered. And I have found, in my experience, it takes a really extraordinary person to be normal in those situations. I know 2 or 3 of them around the world, and I'm always like, God, I don't know how you're normal right now. If I was in your situation, I would be so weird. So when people come up to me and have, maybe weird energy, or treat me like I'm much more attractive than I am, or, are clumsy or uncomfortable or something, that's evidence of this power dynamic. And I think we should just remember, like, that power dynamic is not going away. We can do things to diffuse it in a way, but it's going to be there. It's there to be dealt with. And for our part, we should remember that it's a really normal thing to do, and we shouldn't disrespect people for having that sense of things. Like, I think one of the things that I'm most upset with Stephen about, and really like angry at him for this, is like when I look at his situation with Sarah. Very specifically, it seems to me that Sarah was doing a perfectly okay job of being a young person, a teenager, who would like try some things, test out some boundaries, make some mistakes, and Stephen was doing a terrible job of being a grown-up, who should be that person who says, oh, you're trying to make a terrible decision? I'm going to guide you away from that terrible decision. Let me help you away from that, as opposed to purposefully drawing you into it. And now that's an extreme case, but I think we should try to be helpful when people don't have the best faculties to make some of these decisions.
Yeah. Go ahead, Laura.
Sorry. Just 2 things. As teachers, local teachers, international teachers, I don't care what kind of teacher you are, the Friday beginner teacher before the lesson or before the dance, I would like to see more teachers in class implying or talking about what consent is. And I'm not talking about sexual consent, but even just consent to dance. And that I'd like to see the teacher dynamic of the couple, the leader and the follower, or the man and the woman, be talking about and respecting each other in a way that kind of shows how if she says no, he responds. Or, for example, I see a lot of teachers where one person does all the talking and the other person is kind of silent. I would like to see both the man and the woman, or the lead and the follow, being able to talk. And I would like to see people kind of mention, like, hey, if my partner does something like this that hurts or is slightly uncomfortable, here's a couple of things I do to deal with that situation. And if it really hurts, here's a way that I ask him not to. And just presenting those ideas in class. And then also just mentioning, hey, if you ask a girl to dance and she says yes, great. If you find you have to convince her to dance, she probably doesn't want to dance with you, and you go find somebody else. And those are like the basic ground rules. I mean, we're in such a great position of teaching dance and teaching this physical contact and interaction that we can also lay the boundaries and the ground rules for what consent is in further physical interactions, such as sexual relations, because that's the boundary that I do see being crossed and feel it. I've had so many guys, I cannot even count on all of my limbs and fingers how many guys have manipulated me into dancing with them. And that is not cool at all. In the same way, it's not cool to manipulate somebody into having sex with you. And I just wish that was presented a little bit more and acknowledged a little bit more, even on the basic level of dance interaction.
Yeah, modeling good behavior. I think that's a really good one. Sylvia, you had something you wanted to say?
Well, this is a sort of similar, but in my classes, I've always had young people and old people and people with disabilities, mental and physical disabilities. And for anybody who's underage in my classes, their parent or guardian has to be in the room with them at all times. They can come to class. I've had the youngest person I had take classes 5 years old, but their parents had to be there. When they come to the dances, their parents have to be there. If you're 16, your parent has to be there. They don't have to be holding your hand, but I don't babysit, and I'm also not going to be responsible for babysitting. So I want, I let mom and dad in for free. I don't charge them anything. If they come to the dances, they don't have to be right on top of the kid, but they have to be there. So if anything goes wrong, the parents are super responsible. I'm putting that on the parents, and it's not something where you just dump your kid. I have a little bit of an uneasy feeling about people who let a 16-year-old, I don't care how mature they are, go to a week-long dance camp by themselves when they know drinking is going to be there. Their child is not really equipped to handle this stuff. So I've always insisted that on all privates and whatnot, that if anybody's underage, they have to have a parent or guardian with them. And that has worked out really well for me for the past 30-something years. It just keeps everybody safe, and there's no questions. Also, to be able to help guide that younger person, what Laura's saying, is not to feel manipulated. Their parents are there, going to feel a little less pressured if mom and dad are in the next room than if mom and dad aren't there at all. And I think that's something that we can all kind of help with too, is to empower the younger person on how to deal with some of the pressures that might happen from somebody who's going to try to take advantage of them.
Thanks, Sylvia.
One thing that I just want to note is, like, we should acknowledge that adults are adults, and adults are allowed to make decisions that we don't necessarily think are maybe right or not right, but smart. And for example, I've had a crush on Janina Garofalo since I was like 15 because I think she's very funny and very smart. And if I met Janina Garofalo, I would be smitten with her. And if she wanted to go and make out somewhere, I may do that. And that's my like funny decision that I can make as an adult. And we have to remember that, because I'm not in a position where I'm being abused or manipulated. And I think it's really important that we make a distinction between consensual sexual behavior, which is wonderful and a beautiful thing, and people abusing and manipulating, exploiting, and degrading people. That's the problem. That's what Stephen did. He was doing all those things. He wasn't just having consensual sex with people who they, for whatever reason, because who he was, decided, like, hey, you know what, I'm going to go try to hook up with Stephen today. That's their decision, and that's fine. But the problem is when you use it to abuse or degrade or exploit people. And I think it's really important we make that distinction, because that may seem foolish to someone, but that's not our job to say, like, oh, Andy, you want to go make out with Janina Garofalo because you think she's witty and funny? That's great. This is really a weird thing to admit on the internet. I'm sorry, everyone, but I think it's important to make that distinction. I don't want. Sex is a powerful, beautiful thing, but also a dangerous thing. But I don't want that thing to be what's on trial here. The problem here is abuse, and the problem here is exploitation.
That's a great point, because I think it's a very easy defense, and it's been a lot of people's defense for Stephen, that, hey, these people are adults and they're just having sex, and that's part of the scene, and that's okay. And to the extent that certainly has happened, Stephen has had consensual sex with people, and that's fine. That's totally fine. I think what is difficult for me, and one of the things that surprised me the most, some things surprised me less about the allegations about Stephen, was the consistent pattern that emerged with younger women. And I've heard more than was on the internet, and it seems even worse than what I've heard before. So for myself, it seems very, very clear. I want to I would just love to address a couple things that people have said about Stephen, because I think some of the defenses are really not very good and they show unclear thinking. And like Andy's trying to point out, we're not saying that having sexual interactions in the Lindy Hop scene is a bad thing. You know what I mean? And even if they're ones that we think are bad ideas, it's not the same as being abuse necessarily. People have called Stephen Peter Pan, like he's some forever young spirit. He wasn't aware of the position he held. He was definitely aware of the position he held. And Peter Pan never had sex with any of those kids, which I think is really important to remember. Crucial difference. If you're going to stay young forever, then you don't get to have sex with people. And I think a lot of people have talked about how Stephen's been betrayed by a lot of his friends. And I considered myself a friend of Stephen. And I'll say the only reason that I would sort of, quote, turn on somebody is if I thought they did something really bad. And that's exactly what I think happened here. The things I've heard about are very, very extreme. And I'm really not okay with him, and I do condemn his actions. I don't want him to die broken alone. I want him to be an okay person. I want him to get help. The thing that I think is really, really tricky for our scene is that, especially when we're dealing with things on the internet, but just as people, it's very hard to hold more than one image of a person in your mind, especially someone that you don't know well. And quite often what happens in these weird power dynamics in the scene is that you know a person well on one level, like you may know Stephen very well because you've taken many of his classes, and he might not know you at all. So how he figures into life and how you figure into his is very different. And to the extent that people had a picture of Stephen, that picture changed when these revelations came out. And one of the things that concerns me is actually how quickly he was ousted from the scene. And not because I don't think he should be. I actually won't work with him myself. I won't go to an event where he works, and I think he shouldn't have a place in the scene anymore. But for me, who's Stephen's definitely my biggest mentor. I've learned a ton from him, and I think the good things that he put in the scene, they don't go away because of this. And what is tricky is I think a lot of the discussion about this has been really moving at the pace of the internet, and it's been a lot easier for people who know less about Stephen and just have this one picture to say, okay, now I'm switching to a different picture. There was a good picture, now I change it with a bad picture. What has been my struggle since this happened is to try to merge those two pictures, to realize that, okay, this good picture, that was a true thing, that happened, I know that's the deal. Now there's this bad picture as well, and those two have to somehow become one. And what I haven't seen on the internet is that happening a lot. I've seen people switching very quickly. And I think it would be worthwhile if we keep in mind that everyone can do good and bad things. And so, moving forward, like Naomi mentioned before about questioning people, and Laura said, being careful to not just accuse. Questioning versus accusing is a really big difference. And Andy's statement about sort of trying to engage with people in a way that is respectful, and Sylvia talking about getting people early on, how do we treat people when they're beginners? If we have an idea that one person, even a person that we think is very fancy, very important, that holds this position in the scene, if we have an idea that they can do something bad and still maybe be a good person, I think that's worthwhile. And again, I'm not condemning Stephen. I definitely condemn Stephen, and I think he doesn't have a place in this scene anymore. But I think going forward, we would be more likely to make that observation, make that connection, ask that question, and engage with that person than we otherwise would if we didn't feel that any sort of discussion, questioning, or anything about it meant that we were taking this positive picture that we had of that person and throwing it away and turning it into a negative picture, which would then ruin their life, career, and everything. I think we should keep in mind with Stephen and with people who we see maybe a little further than we want on that spectrum of inappropriate behavior, that there's going to be good in people and bad in people, and when we see the bad, let's look at his actions and see if it crosses the line, but we should feel okay talking to people about their actions and knowing that we're not talking about them as a sum whole total of a person. And maybe it can take some of the pressure down, and we can be a little bit more engaged and look the other way less often, I think, is something that I would really love to come out of this whole thing.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. You've a ton of really good points there, and you did a better job summing up than I would have been able to. So we're about out of time. There's a ton more I would like to hear from these people, but we also have the internet for this. So I want to just thank you all for being on this call, for participating in this discussion. I got a lot of value out of this. I'm sure everyone who's watching is going to as well. Thank you for being a part of it, and I look forward to seeing how we all make our scene better and safer in the future.